people talk about the Amazon, they often look from above, forests, maps, vast numbers. But for the Kayapo people, the Amazon is where life unfolds day by day. And as the forest begins to change, the story of the Kayapo is no longer one of silence, but a voice that cannot be ignored. Before these changes took place, the lives of the Kayapo people were closely tied to the Amazon rainforest in a very concrete and practical way. The Kayapo are one of the larger indigenous communities in Brazil, with around 10,000 people living across the Xingu River basin. They do not live apart from the forest, nor do they see it as a distant or unfamiliar space, but as the setting where everyday life unfolds. In traditional daily life, the Kayapo hunt, fish, and practice small-scale farming, enough to sustain the community without exhausting the surrounding environment.
Right, he's saying go.
Movement largely follows rivers and familiar forest paths. Areas used for hunting, cultivation, or communal activities are not marked by fixed boundaries, but by shared understanding built over time. In Kayapo life, the forest is at once a source of food, a space for social interaction, and a place where collective memory is held. Their social life is organized around strong bonds between community members.
Sama ito. Yeah.
Rituals, body painting, and traditional dress among the Kayapo do not exist merely as decorative elements. They are among the most visible signs of a carefully structured social order. Colors painted on the skin, geometric patterns, necklaces, bracelets, and feathered headdresses are not used at random, but are tied to specific moments in community life. Through these signs, outsiders can recognize who is participating in a ritual, who holds important roles, and who is at a particular stage of social life. They are embedded in communal activities, marking significant events and expressing relationships between individuals. In this context, culture is not an abstract idea, but an inseparable part of everyday life. For a long time, This way of living was stable enough to maintain a balance between people and their environment. The forest was not seen as something to be exploited to its limits, but as a space that needed to be sustained in order to continue supporting the community. For the Kayapo, living in the Amazon was not a symbolic or idealized choice, but a simple reality of life, much like any other community connected to its homeland. Only when the surrounding environment began to change did this familiar order start to be tested. What had once been considered stable no longer functioned in the same way, and the daily lives of the Kayapo began to require adjustment.
Nangetere amite kai prenegeno nangete
Yumare kukwa kameba kukamore makum mekum emane anyuroba naba emane anyuroba naba kabenyare joy lo nyumi karua nyume
The changes around the Amazon do not happen suddenly, but build up gradually over time. For the Kayapo people, the first signs are not abstract ideas, but disruptions in everyday life. Familiar paths through the forest become harder to use. Hunting and fishing no longer follow the same rhythms. Activities repeated across generations begin to require constant adjustment.
Trazer de volta para nós o rio, o peixe, a terra, a floresta, animais.
As the forest is fragmented by extraction activities and new infrastructure, the Kayapo's living space shrinks in very tangible ways. Areas once used for hunting or communal gatherings become difficult to access. Food sources grow less predictable, forcing families to rethink how they divide their time and labor. This is not an immediate disappearance of traditional life, but a growing sense that what was once familiar is becoming harder to sustain with each passing day. These changes also affect how knowledge is passed down. When the environment no longer follows old patterns, the experience of previous generations does not always provide clear answers for the next. What once ensured safety in daily life now needs to be reconsidered. An order built on repetition and stability begins to lose its reliability, pushing community life into a state of uncertainty. It is within this context that the Kaipo begin to speak out more openly. This does not come from a desire to represent a global cause, but from a very practical need to explain why the changes taking place make it impossible for life to continue as before. When everyday activities are directly affected, remaining silent is no longer a viable option. The Kayapo engage with journalists, appear on camera, and take part in public meetings to talk about what is happening to the forest and to their lives.
Tôi thì nhập từ các cam ya dia mai pega boi ne ho mo ne ka malu ka ju
Ya banan cho edaye ambo bunu kama ipika kama kutine ompu ompune to agame.
Mana moya unyo wakati almai taminine kotnya ka malmai taminine wa mana ya minine ka malmai tanya ka almai te aminine unyo wakati boy kam me bego kle kukla jane kam ne ba ayane nyu me kuni kute mari ne kute
Isso aqui é acabação.
Katinya kambame peranyo hakatika maben puji hinyo bikwame inoi kanikoi.
As a result, the Kayapo gradually come to be recognized as one of the most outspoken indigenous communities when the Amazon is discussed. What matters, however, is how they speak. Traditional clothing, body painting, and their public presence are not meant as performances or attention-seeking displays, but as extensions of cultural life into a new space. This is how they bring their own language of identity outward, helping others understand that changes in the Amazon are not only environmental issues, but issues that affect people who live in the forest.
Negaraku kami, apa ini dikuati, katanya kami bah, kalau amu jape aitem kaji, papa jaja kamja, bapa ne kabente, bapa mau kata, mei ne kabente, ne bapa ni, mei ne kabente, bapa mana punya kam. Amjau kami jamne amu yo tenta akute guarda ne kabenia kuni amu yo tenta ji amima lekam mnami kute.
The escalation of the story does not lie in a single conflict, but in a layering of many small shifts, a changing environment, disrupted daily life, and a community compelled to step beyond familiar spaces to speak about its own existence. From this point on, the Kayapo are no longer only those affected by change, but one of the voices most often mentioned when the Amazon is discussed, not because they sought that role, but because they could no longer continue living in silence.
Clubs, the Kaipo have brought along video cameras. A forest tribe have jumped an entire industrial revolution and are using tools of high-tech communication. The villages back in the forest will be able to see how a hydroelectric dam affects the rivers and...
In that context, the Kayapo people do not stop at speaking out. More importantly, they continue to live, on their own terms, in an environment that is no longer the same as before. Daily life goes on, hunting, farming, communal activities, and the organization of rituals. Cultural practices do not disappear, but are adjusted to fit new circumstances. At the same time, the Kayapo begin using modern tools to document that very life. Cameras, images, and media do not replace traditional culture. Instead, they become part of how it is preserved and shared. Through this, the Kayapo appear not only in public moments, but also in everyday ones, family life, festivals, and rhythms tied to the forest. Culture, in this case, is not presented as a static heritage, but as an ongoing practice. The turning point of the story does not lie in the Kayapo becoming symbols of the Amazon, but in their refusal to be invisible. Appearing before the world is not about representing a global issue, but about affirming that they are people living in this forest, with very real needs, choices, and responsibilities. The Kayapo are not trying to return to an idealized past, they are trying to continue living in the present, with what remains and what is changing. From here, the story turns back to the viewer. When we talk about the Amazon, we often ask questions about forest coverage, climate, or the future of the planet. Alongside those questions, however, there is another that is just as important. Are the communities who live in the forest seen as living subjects, or merely as parts of a problem to be solved? Perhaps what truly matters is not how many traditional elements the Kaipo have managed to keep, but whether they are still able to live with their culture in a changing world. Culture does not exist to be frozen or preserved from a distance, but to be practiced every day. And as long as communities like the Kayapo still have the space to continue living, the Amazon remains a place with people, not just a forest on a map. When looking back at the Amazon, perhaps the question is not only what the forest will become in the future, but how the people who live within it are being forced to change without losing themselves. The Kayapo people are not asking to be idealized, nor do they want to be reduced to symbols. They are simply trying to ensure that their lives do not become invisible within larger narratives. If this video has encouraged you to pay closer attention to communities that often appear only in the margins, feel free to share your thoughts in the comments. And if you're interested in more stories about culture, everyday life, and how people adapt in a changing world, you can follow the channel to continue the journey.